All right, I think we'll get started then. So my name is Amali Perera. I'm one of the physiotherapists here at Advanced Rehab Center. The topic today is on MS fatigue. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the chat box. I will hopefully have some time at the end of the presentation to go through those and answer any of those questions for you. It's good to see there's already a chat box there. Good, yeah. Good morning. All right. So first of all, I'll start by talking about the MS physiology. So basically the pathophysiology of MS. It's having difficulty with the slides. Just give me a second. Oh, seem to be a bit stuck here. Just give me a second, sorry. There we go. Okay, so MS pathophysiology. So basically, as you know, MS is a degenerative progressive neurological condition where it affects the nerves of the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is consisting of the brain, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, and the part of the brain that connects the brain to the spinal cord known as the brainstem. So within the brain, you have nerve cells, and they have a sheath called the myelin sheath that covers this long branch that extends from the cell body of the nerves. And essentially the role of the myelin is to act like a protective coating that is insulating to increase the conductivity of the nerves. So it increases the efficiency and the speed of conduction so the nerves can communicate to each other and eventually to the body in an effective and efficient manner. So what happens in MS is the body recognizes this myelin sheath as something foreign and causes an inflammatory reaction that attacks it, leading to a patchy breakdown. So when this happens, as you can imagine, that really impacts the way the nerves communicate because it can slow down the conduction of the nerves or stop that messages from getting from point A to B altogether. So you can think of the role of myelin as the protective covering around a wire of any electrical wire. So we thought that it really affects the way the messages get across. So these lesions that happen in MS can happen anywhere within the central nervous system. So it could be in the brain, could be in the spinal cord, and depending on where these lesions occur, it can lead to a whole raft of different symptoms. And because of this, each person with MS is quite unique in the way they present, and they have their own unique set of symptoms. So there are 3 types of MS, broadly speaking. So relapsing remitting is the most common. And if you look at the top graph here, on the vertical axis, you have the level of symptoms, and on the horizontal, you have the time. So with the relapsing remitting form, there can be a transient and sudden increase in symptoms. And after a period of time, this can reduce and resolve, which is known as a remitting period. So in some people, this can completely resolve, so your function can return to baseline levels. But in some people, this only recovers partially, so you can get some lingering symptoms. And over a period of time, these can recur again. And again, if you only get partial resolution, you can get this stacking up of these symptoms. This usually happens due to the inflammatory processes of MS that causes the demyelination. Majority of people with relapsing remitting form then go on to develop this secondary progressive form of MS. So as the name suggests, it always starts with the relapsing remitting type of MS. And then after a period of time, people can get symptoms without this clear remitting and relapsing form presentation. So people can get changes in symptoms without any clear changes within their brain scans or images. Although in this same type of MS, you can get periods of stability where the symptoms remain stable. Primary progressive is the least common type, which affects about 15% of people with MS. And the main difference is that from the time of diagnosis, you get this steady decline in symptoms without the clear relapsing remitting form that you see in the other types. So before we go more specifically about fatigue, I'll just quickly touch on some of the more common symptoms. So muscle fatigue is also a really common symptom, usually starts distally in the feet and also in your hands, and can work its way up, although everyone's different in the way they present. So this is a general rule. Sensory disturbances are also another common symptom. In some cases, this can present as, loss of ability to discriminate between hot surfaces or cold surfaces, or changes to touch or sensation of touch or pressure. One of the other types of sensations that's affected is also known as proprioception. So this is the ability of your body to recognize the joint position or your sense of position in space. So as you can imagine, this can have a profound impact on your balance. So if you do have balance issues, it is something to be looked at to see if that is a contribution of sensory loss adding to your balance problems. So the changes to muscle strength and sensation can then, of course, affect your balance and other functional patterns, as well as your walking pattern. So this can make these activities much more energy consuming and less efficient. Pain is also another common symptom, and sometimes pain can result due to the direct nerve damage. So this is referred to as neuropathic pain and can be experienced as burning, sharp, shooting, stabbing kind of pain. It is a tricky type of pain to manage, usually requires a multidisciplinary team consisting of physiotherapists to help you guide with exercises to desensitize this pain, doctors and neurologists to provide you with appropriate medication and analgesia, because most typical analgesia such as Panadol would not help with this type of pain. And the other important member of this team is also the psychologist, in the way, in terms of helping you sort of guide your thought processes around pain and how you perceive your pain, because that can also add to this type of pain. The other contributions to pain in MS is through non-neuropathic types, such as, due to biomechanical changes or overuse of certain joints. If you tend to use certain muscles more, you might get pain through that. So if you have these symptoms, it's really important that you talk to your healthcare team, your physiotherapist, to see how you can best manage them. Spasticity is also another common symptom. This usually happens due to the nerve damage, and this can usually lead to an uncoordinated way of engaging the muscles or overactivation, and you can feel this as a sense of muscle stiffness or resistance to passive movement, and untreated it can lead to contraction. So again, it can be managed, and it's managed through a coordinated approach through your neurologist and your physios. So it's just certainly something to get checked, because it can again make your movements less efficient and more energy consuming. Cognitive changes are also surprisingly common, even from the early stages of diagnosis. So if you or your family notices any changes around this area, speak to your occupational therapist about how you can manage these symptoms and see what strategies you can put into place, and what sort of exercises you can start straight away. Heat sensitivity we'll talk soon, and bladder and bowel changes are also another common changes that people see in terms of retention or incontinence. Again, all these primary symptoms can add to fatigue. So if you have any of those symptoms that you don't feel is managed well, talk to your team about getting them under control, because it can certainly contribute to your fatigue as well. So before we talk about fatigue in detail, I just want to differentiate between primary and secondary symptoms. Primary symptoms, as we mentioned, like the ones in the previous slide, are from direct nerve damage or as a direct consequence of the MS disease process of demyelination or nerve damage. The secondary symptoms, on the other hand, are not directly related to your MS disease process, but it's a complication of your primary symptoms. For example, if you have fatigue as a primary symptom and this limits you from doing activities or forcing you to adopt a more sedentary lifestyle, this is likely to make you develop more weakness as due to disuse and inactivity. So that weakness that you develop through that is a secondary weakness, and it's got nothing to do with the nerve damage from the MS disease process. So, and given that about 80% of people with MS don't meet the guidelines set out by WHO for exercise and physical activity, it wouldn't be surprising that most people with MS carry a lot of secondary symptoms that are treatable, that are contributing to their level of function and independence. Secondary symptoms can also increase the chance of developing other secondary health complications such as diabetes, heart disease, and other neurological conditions. So it's really important that these preventable symptoms are controlled as best as possible. Okay, so what is fatigue? So tiredness is something that most people feel, and it's a normal physiological response that reminds us to have a rest. But in about 80% of people with MS, the level of tiredness can be so significant and debilitating that is known as fatigue. So how does it differ from general tiredness? So MS fatigue can be experienced on a daily basis. It can be random and sudden in onset, and it can take a long time to resolve. And it can also affect the way, your day-to-day functions, and can be quite debilitating. And at times it may not really correlate with any of the activities, or you might wake up tired after sleep as well. One thing about fatigue is, even though it is one of the most common symptoms of MS, it is also an invisible symptom. And what this means is it's not as obvious like a weakness that changes your walking pattern. So it can be tricky for some people to relate to that or empathize with that. And this can have a negative emotional and psychological impact for people. MS fatigue is also one of the causes for loss of independence, and the biggest cause for people to leave their employment earlier. And it can impact your social and community engagement, such as being able to go to the shops and to meet friends at the cafe. So it can have really big impact in that role in the community. There are two main types of fatigue: central and neuromuscular fatigue. So we'll talk about the central fatigue first. Central fatigue, as we mentioned, is that general fatigue that is unrelenting. It's there regardless of what you might have been doing. And for this type of fatigue, there can be contributions from the primary symptoms, so it's directly related to the MS disease process, and also from secondary symptoms due to unmanaged primary symptoms. So from the primary perspective, one of the biggest reasons is a person who has MS, their brain has to work about 30 to 50% harder to carry out the same task as someone who doesn't have that. And this is because of the nerve lesions. It makes the communication less efficient. So if you think about the nerve network in the brain and the central nervous system to a road network, and if you imagine that all the toll roads in Sydney are suddenly going under construction and you're forced to take another route, or some of the by roads, sometimes you might have to take small one-way roads and gravel roads. So this would make your journey a lot longer. You'd need to maybe even pump up more petrol, using up more energy. And this is exactly what's happening in the brain. So when some of those most efficient pathways are affected through the lesions or loss of, because of nerve damage, you're forced to take longer paths to get the message from point A to B, taking up more energy. So even simple things like reading a book or watching TV is going to use up more energy when you have MS. So secondary contributions to central fatigue is due to some of those other symptoms that we already mentioned, such as pain, stress, depression. They can all contribute to the way you perceive your level of fatigue and the way you move. Adopting, an altered pattern of walking can be more energy consuming, so that can also contribute to your fatigue, as well as loss of sleep. So getting those symptoms controlled as best as you can also help your fatigue levels as well. So what's neuromuscular fatigue? Neuromuscular fatigue is different to central fatigue in that it directly affects the muscles. So it's fatigue at the muscle level. So if you look at this muscle here, you can see that it's made out of multiple bundles within the muscle. And in a healthy muscle, when it engages, it doesn't not all those bundles engages all at the same time. So what they would do is a few of those bundles would engage, and when they get tired, they'll pass the baton on to the next few bundles. Then when they get tired, and so on and so forth. And then eventually it'll return back to the original bundles that started the process. But by this time, it would have enough time for the blood flow to come through, replenish the energy and take away the waste product. So it's good to go again. But if some of those bundles are affected or damaged through the MS disease process, then you would have less bundles to share that work around. So by the time it returns back to the original set of bundles to carry out the muscle process, it's sort of going half tank, and it's gonna get tired much more quickly. So here's one of the things to consider when you're exercising or engaging in physical activity, to ensure that you give yourself a good rest between different sets to make sure that you get the most out of that exercise. This may, so neuromuscular fatigue may present like a foot drop. So when you first start walking, you might get a lovely foot clearance, but after a period of time, you might start to see a bit more scuffing. But if you rest on the park bench for a period of time, and then you start walking again, you're able to achieve that lovely foot clearance again. So that's essentially muscle fatigue or neuromuscular fatigue happening at the level of your muscles that control your foot clearance. Okay, so heat sensitivity. This is also another big contributor to fatigue. So the reason this happens is because when your core body temperature increases, it slows down your nerve conduction even more. So given that there's already slowing down through the lesions, this heat increase can slow it down further. So people may start to experience more neurological symptoms. Sometimes it could be more weakness, more sensory changes or pain. And also to top that, people with MS sometimes have difficulty in terms of sweating. So that sweating process is one of the main things that we rely on for cooling. And this is not always available in people with MS. So that can also add to the degree of body temperature rising, the increase. So because of this, when you exercise, it is actually quite normal for people to experience an increase in their neurological symptoms for about 30 minutes after the exercises. And it's quite a normal process, nothing to worry about. But you would expect this to resolve as the body cools down. If it doesn't resolve in 2 hours and it tends to last for more than 24 hours though, that's a sign that you've overdone it and you need to change that program and look at the way you're resting and cooling when you're doing the exercises. Okay, so how can you cool your body when you do exercises? So it's best to pre-cool, cool during and after the exercises. One of the best ways to do this is to sip really cold water, ideally 2 degrees. So it's like slushy, icy, slushy consistency. So what you can do is to keep a bottle of water in the freezer overnight. Before you start the exercises, take it out, take a few sips, and then as you exercise too, sip away. So you keep your core temperature cool as you do the exercises. Look at your home environment, make sure there's good ventilation, there's an AC or fan available when you're doing the exercises. Having a cool bath or a shower, or using aids such as cooling bands, vests. There's a whole raft of things like cooling mats, caps that can help you keep cool, especially on hot summer days when you have to go out. So if you aren't sure about where to source those, there's plenty of websites, and have a chat to your OT and your physio about how you can access those. Okay, so how to manage fatigue. So one of the best ways you can do this is by energy management through pacing and avoiding boom-bust patterns. So when people have chronic fatigue, there is a tendency to do less, rest more, and avoid certain activities. Although this can be helpful at first, the more you get into this pattern, you can become more and more sedentary. And when you do actually have to return back to doing some of those things, you'd be more sensitive to fatigue. So it's not the best way of managing that central type of fatigue. The other pattern that we also see is this boom bust behavior. So boom part is basically when you're feeling well, you might be inclined to catch up on all the things that you've been putting off. So just get it all out of the way, get it done. But what happens is at the end of that boom, your energy levels can come crashing down, which is known as a bust. So then this pattern can repeat and can have this roller coaster effect of, boom and bust behavior, which can lead to your fatigue actually dictating your level of activity. Unfortunately, this can reinforce your physical disabilities and have a negative emotional and psychological impact in the long run. So again, we want to try and avoid that pattern. So what can you do about it? So one of the places where you could start off is by keeping a fatigue diary. So it looks a bit like this, like the image at the top here. So in this table, there's a column for each hour of the day. And within that column, you have a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being no fatigue, and 10 being maximum fatigue. So for each time slot, you'd be writing what you've done at that time and giving yourself a rating from 0 to 10. So, and then you do that for the next few hours of the day and do this for over several weeks. And once you do that, you have information that shows you what you consider as high energy activities, medium, low, and recharging or replenishing activities. And these activities would be different for every single person. For someone, cooking would be a medium level activity. For some, it could be a high energy activity. So it's very individualized. So it's really important that you keep a record for several weeks so you can get that good, well-rounded information. So once you have that, you can use that information to pace yourself better. So when people have chronic fatigue, sleep may not always be of good quality. And a lot of people do rely on sleep to feel recharged. But if you're not getting that, you can't always rely on sleep to improve your level of fatigue. You can think of your energy levels as a battery. So if you use up a lot of your battery power, it's going to take a lot longer to recharge that battery. Whereas if you do a little, recharge, do a little again, recharge, it's not going to be so up and down. You're going to maintain this steady pace of energy level. So essentially, that's what we want to do with your activities and the way you schedule and pace your routine as well. So once you identify which activities are high energy, you can spread them better throughout the day or throughout the week. You can also balance them by alternating your high energy activities with low energy or replenishing activities. You can also break down what you consider as high energy activities into smaller chunks. For example, if you consider vacuuming as a high energy activity, rather than doing the whole house, you can perhaps break it down to just doing one room at a time. So then you convert that high energy activity into a low energy activity. Also, once you do this, it's good to make sure that you maintain a similar level of energy between days. So you don't have some days that are much more energy consuming, whereas others not so much. You want to try and maintain that level so your body gets used to that level of demands. Another really important way to manage central fatigue is scheduling a regular rest. Because the brain is working 30 to 50% times harder, even just doing small activities, when you schedule this rest, you want to make sure that you're not stimulating your brain at all. So there's no activity. So watching TV, reading a book, listening to music, they're all still going to be stimulating your brain. So when you schedule this rest, make sure you actually have no stimulation. So one of the best things you can do is to have a nap for about 20 minutes. So if you can nap, that's great. Set the alarm for 20 minutes. Make sure you don't sleep for longer, because if you get into a longer sleep, you can enter a deep sleep cycle, which can affect your sleep quality at night. If you're not a napper though, and you can't nap during the day, you can you seek other alternative options, such as perhaps mindfulness or meditation. So anything that's very low energy or low stimulating activities as an alternative. If sometimes you might need to schedule even two of those 20-minute rests a day, depending on how fatigued you are. Ideally, keeping those rests to the same time helps your body get used to that pattern as well. So daily routine and sleep hygiene. We are all creatures of habit. We all have a 24-hour internal body clock. So, if you can wake up, have your meals, sleep at the same time every day, your body can get used to that pattern. So, if you have trouble doing this, speak to your occupational therapist about how you can best manage your day. Another area OTs can help is sleep hygiene. Looking at different strategies you can use to improve your sleep quality. So some of these things could be avoid bringing stress into your bedroom or where you sleep. So avoid working in the room or reading or watching TV shows that can be very stimulating. Looking at the environment as well, making sure your noise, light and temperature is all optimal, making sure your bedding meets the pressure care needs and is comfortable. Also managing stress and worry. For a lot of people, when they go to sleep, that's probably when all these stressful thoughts come through. Write those down, get them out of your head and park it until a time that is more conducive to looking at those more constructively. Also speak to your psychologist about managing your stress and worry if this is an issue for you. Other considerations: diet and hydration. So diet, a healthy diet and hydration is really important, considering our brain is made up of about 85% fluid. Dehydration can have a huge impact on physiological function. So it's really important that you stay hydrated. So if you're a lady, you need to take about 8 glasses of water a day. If you're a man, about 10 glasses of water a day. Medication. There are some medications that can add to fatigue, whereas there are some that can be used to help with fatigue, especially if those other lifestyle changes aren't working for you. So have a chat to your neurologist about how you can, best manage your fatigue from a medical point of view. Orthotics and gait aids, as we mentioned earlier, if you're using a walking pattern that is quite inefficient from an energy point of view, you can improve that by having the right orthotics and gait aids, and this can ultimately give you more energy to do things that you actually enjoy doing or want to be doing. Okay, and exercise. So exercise has a huge impact on fatigue as well. But first we will just talk about the other uses of exercise, particularly for MS as well. So historically, exercise was not recommended in MS due to the fears of fatigue and risk of increasing the chance of relapses. However, to date, there's actually no published research that shows any link between adverse effects of exercise towards fatigue or relapses. So we can safely rule that one out. However, there's still some barriers regarding exercise for certain people due to those historical fears. So exercise can, as we all know, improve strength, fitness, balance, and pain, and in some cases in as little as 6 to 8 weeks. Of course, if you have more long-term chronic issues, it can take a bit longer, but in most cases, you will feel a change in such a short time as 6 to 8 weeks. Exercise can also have a role in slowing down the disease process, especially this is seen more in animal studies, harder to prove in humans, but it can certainly have a role in this area, which is quite exciting. Especially when you do exercise at a higher intensity, it can have an anti-inflammatory level anti-inflammatory effect at the brain level and a neuroprotective effect through the production of certain chemicals known as brain-derived neurotrophic factors. It can also help with neuroplasticity, which is basically the rewiring of the brain, and as a result, hopefully slow down the disease process. Exercise can also reduce the risk of other secondary health conditions, as we mentioned, and improve functional independence. And so its role in fatigue. So research shows that exercise can have a small but significant improvement in fatigue. And this is by increasing the overall strength and endurance. So that way, when you go on to do everyday tasks, it'll feel less fatiguing. To start a program, you want to make sure you start off small. So even just bursts of 10 seconds of intensity exercises, followed by a period of rest, and increasing the time that you exercise or the number of reps that you do gradually over a period of 6 weeks or more. So it's best to be guided in this process, so that way you don't overdo things or get into it, too much too soon. Other ways you can pace yourself better is to use different muscle groups. So you can work on your arms and then legs and then the core and then return back to the arms again, so your muscles have time to recover. And this is especially important for managing that neuromuscular type of fatigue, but also looking at the cooling strategies for cooling prior to, during, and after exercises, and the high intensity interval training. So basically where you do maybe 10 seconds of high intensity exercises followed by 30 seconds of rest, and then gradually you will have a more one-to-one ratio of exercises as your endurance increases. So that's essentially me in a nutshell. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write them on the chat box, and I will try and go through those over the next few minutes.